Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our online Bible study, members and visitors alike. And as you know, on our Bible study, we have a thought to think about, a question to ponder, and a text to study. This is an opportunity for you to do some learning and obviously meet up with someone in a life group or just pairing up with someone, grabbing a coffee or whatever, and talking through the content of what we are learning tonight. And thinking about how we and studying the scriptures together and applying this into our lives. Well, what I want to do just over these next 3 weeks is to start a new teaching series. I'm actually going to take us through the book of Psalms and the Song of Solomon. Now, obviously, we don't have time to look at every psalm by any means, but what I want to do is give an overview of Psalms and the greatest of song, the Song of Solomon, and look about what is the flavor of these two books, what are they about. And in essence, I believe that the book of Psalms and the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, is about thinking and feeling with God. And so what I want to do tonight is just give an introduction into this. Next week, we'll look at some examples of different types of Psalms, and then we'll close looking at the Song of Solomon itself. You know, the greatest command in the Bible is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I find it's interesting that in the Bible, you'll find a mixture of two types of literature. You'll find prose, which is the language of the mind, or you get it in stories, but you also find poetry, which is the language of the heart. And I believe that prose helps us to love God with all our mind. But poetry, as I said, being the language of the heart, helps us to love God with all our hearts, with our feeling. And so really, as we're looking, as I mentioned, on this study of Psalms and the Song of Solomon, I'm subheading it, Thinking and Feeling with God. Thinking and Feeling with God. So when it comes to poetry, I believe that poetry has a much deeper effect on the human personality than actually prose does. It goes deeper into the mind, than prose. We remember poetry, don't we? More so than we do from reading words from a boring textbook. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Nursery rhymes, we remember them, don't they? Because there's a rhythm and there's a meter to them that enables us to remember poetry. Poetry also goes deeper into our heart. It evokes emotions, sometimes of warmth, sometimes of humor. For example, they walked down the lane together. The sky was full of stars. Together they reached the farmyard gate. He lifted for her the bars. She neither smiled nor thanked him. Indeed, she not knew how, for he was just a farmer's boy, and she was a Jersey cow. Okay, so poetry evokes emotions. Poetry stirs our emotions. It's easy to remember. But poetry also does something else. It galvanizes our will. It goes deeper into will. It sometimes moves us to make determined action or to act in a certain way. We often know that soldiers going to battle throughout times have often sung songs together as a way of galvanizing the will for war. So poetry has a much deeper effect on our emotions, on our will, and even on our mind and our intellect. What is poetry? Well, it consists mainly of three parts. Often poetry consists of rhythm or meter. It consists of rhyme, where words sound similar to each other, and repetition, where we get a form of what we call parallelism, where one phrase repeats or reinforces the previous phrase. When we're thinking about Hebrew poetry, which is obviously what the Psalms were written in, it relies much more on rhythm and repetition than it does in rhyme. You often find in the Hebrew language that words aren't rhymed with each other, but there is a form of repetition and there is a rhythm in that. Hebrew poetry has four types of repetition or parallelism that we often see throughout the book of Psalms. And I'm going to give you some words here, and I ask you not to be put off by these words, because later on when we do our little text study, there's a bit of a homework for you to do and ask you to come back to. But there's 4 types of parallelism or repetition that you often find in Hebrew poetry. The first is synonymous parallelism, where the same thought is expressed twice in a different way in the second part of the phrase. So for example, in Psalm 19 verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. So clearly the phrase the skies parallels the word the heavens, and the word proclaim parallels the word declares. So there's what we call a synonymous parallelism there in that repetition, okay, in that poetry. Another type of parallelism that we get, or repetition, is what we call antithetic parallelism, okay? And in this kind, what you'll find is that the second phrase doesn't repeat the first phrase in a different way, but what it does, it serves as a contrast to the first phrase. So for example, Psalm 126 says, "Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy." Okay, so those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy. He who goes out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with him. Okay, and so clearly sowing is compared with reaping. Weeping is compared with joy. And so we get synonymous parallelism, we get antithetic parallelism, okay? Another type of parallelism that we get in Hebrew poetry is what we call synthetic parallelism. And in this case, the second phrase complements or supplements the first phrase. So Psalm 23 is a great example of this. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want." Okay, so the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. And then it says, "He makes me lie down in green pastures besides still waters." And so the second phrase complements or supplements the first phrase. And then one other type of Hebrew parallelism, or repetition, that we get throughout the scriptures is something called a chiasm. I hope I'm pronouncing these words right. But effectively, a chiasm in Hebrew poetry is where the second part of the first line becomes the first part of the second line. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. "The Lord watches over the way of the righteous." So the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. But the way of the wicked will perish. So notice how the second part of the first sentence, the way of the righteous, is sort of is complemented in some ways with the first part of the second sentence, but the way of the wicked. So the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. And then finally, of course, sorry about this, for all this technical detail, for all you wonderful grammatarians out there listening to our Bible study, there is another type of interesting Hebrew parallelism that we get in the Psalms, and that is what we call acrostics. Now, in an acrostic, what you'll find is that each successive line in that psalm starts with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and a perfect example of this is Psalm 119. In some of your Bibles, you might notice, if you look at Psalm 119, that each segment of Psalm 119 starts with a consecutive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And so it's just a way, obviously, in the original language of remembering the psalm much more easier. And so this form of poetry, where we get repetition, whether we get rhythm, and particularly in the Hebrew language, is a powerful way of conveying thoughts and feelings about God that are communicated to God. And that is why that poetical books in the Bible, like the book of Psalms, like the book of Job, like the book of Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, are mostly about thinking and feeling with God. Now, as I mentioned, I want to just focus a little bit about in the book of Psalms, and I'm going to do a bit of an overview in the book of Psalms and the authorship of Psalms, and then next week we will look at something of the different types of Psalms that we come across. But the book of Psalms, as you know, is the most the most loved part of the whole Bible. There is a timeless quality about them, and it is just as appealing to today's culture as it was the time when they were first penned. And the reason for that is because Psalms deals with a whole array and gamut of our human emotions. It deals with our fears, it deals with our sadnesses, it deals when we're feeling happy, it deals when we're feeling angry, it deals when we're feeling depressed. Think of all the emotions that we feel. The Psalms encapsulates all the human emotions. But what it does, it makes it redemptive because it leads us to a place of worship and prayer to God. And so when you're feeling depressed, or when you're feeling happy, or when you're feeling really frustrated and ticked off and angry about things, there's a psalm for every occasion for where you are at. You know, Psalm 56 describes how God has put our tears in his bottle, or literally in his wineskin. You know, at the funerals, when Jewish people would send people a token of their remorse and grief, normally we would send flowers to people to express our condolences. But many Jewish people, what they do is that they send a small vial, a small bottle of tears, just to express the sense of loss of a loved one. And so I love how in the book of Psalms, how God describes in Psalm 56 how he puts our tears into his bottle. And so, of course, the Psalms touch the human emotions. They meet us where we're at in terms of how we're feeling. Now, the Hebrew word actually for psalm is telahim, which means praise. It also relates to the word for the tribe of Judah, Yehudah, which is where we get the word Jews. And Yehudah, or Jew, literally means praise or thanksgiving to God. And so the book of Psalms is the Jewish prayer and hymn book of the Old Testament, consisting of 150 songs, all collated from the period of about 1300 years before the birth of Christ to about 500 years before Jesus' birth, during the time of the Jewish exile. And during that time, many songs, many worship songs, many were written down, were collated, and they were actually collated to be part of the book of Psalms. And so you will find that throughout the Bible, we have a whole range of psalms. Now, not all the psalms are actually found in the book of Psalms. There are some psalms that are found in other parts of the Bible. For example, Deborah wrote a psalm that is found in Exodus and Judges chapter 5. Miriam wrote a song that's found itself in Exodus 15. But most of the psalms are actually found in the book of Psalms. Now, if you read the book of Psalms, you'll notice that all 150 psalms are divided into 5 books. Books 1, which is Psalms 1 to 42. Book 2, Psalms 42 to 72. Book 3, Psalms 73 to 89. Book 4, Psalms 90 to 106. And Book 5, Psalms 107 to 150. Okay? And what is interesting, that the last psalm in each of these books tends to close with a doxology, or a praise to God. Psalm 150, which is the last psalm of all the psalms, is a psalm of praise. And it seems to be a psalm that encapsulates all the psalms that go before it. Now, for some reason, this book of Psalms is divided into these 5 books. Scholars have debated as to why that is. Does it meant to reflect the 5 books of the law, or the Torah, of the Old Testament? We don't know. Some people think that maybe the Psalms, when they originally collated for ease of use, they were stored in 5 separate scrolls. But no one really knows why they are arranged the way they are in 5 books. When you read the Psalms, you'll notice a number of features of them. Firstly, they have a title, and then they would often have a musical notation. The title normally gives the name of the songwriter as well as the context in which the psalm was written. So, for example, Psalm 3 was written in the context of David fleeing from his son Solomon. And then also you get these musical notations throughout the book of Psalms. For example, one of the most famous ones is Selah. Okay, so you're reading the Psalms, you're wondering, have you ever thought, what does that word Selah mean? Well, it literally means pause and think about it. Okay, so when you come across a Selah in the book of Psalms, it literally means just pause, stop there, think about what you just read. Again, in Psalm 3, we have 3 Selahs, 3 opportunities just to pause and think about what you've been reading. You also get other musical terms like a maskil, or a gittith, or a shagayan, or a miskal. And again, many scholars are doing various research as to what these musical terms mean, but we don't fully know what they mean. And so hopefully that kind of gives you a bit of an introduction into what Psalms, the nature, the makeup of Psalms is. Finally, what about the authorship of Psalms? Who wrote it? Well, the answer is lots of people wrote it. Just like today we have many songwriters throughout, so we have many psalmists who've contributed to this book. However, some songwriters wrote more psalms than others. So what I'm going to do, just in closing of this part of our study, I want us to look at who were the most popular songwriters in the book of Psalms. Well, right at the very top, of course, is David. He wrote 73 of the 150 Psalms. David wasn't just a shepherd. He wasn't just a warrior. He wasn't just a king. He was also a poet, a musician, and fundamentally he was a worshipper. As we will see, David wrote many different kinds of psalms. We read in 1 Samuel 16 that David would play the harp in Saul's presence. In fact, when Saul felt an evil spirit was coming upon Saul, David would get out his harp and he would just play it, and he would bring worship to God, and that restrained the evil spirit. Okay, and so David was a worshipper. At his heart, you're spending his time out in the fields just worshiping God. That's what he loved to do. And in fact, in the book of Chronicles, it describes in great length the details and the preparation that David put into building and preparing for the temple, because he wanted to build a house of worship. And David's heart, fundamentally, he was a worshipper who loved to worship God in music and in poetry. And so we see that many of the Psalms were written by David. In fact, many of them were written at points of crisis in his life. Psalm 3 we saw when he was fleeing from his son Solomon. Psalm 51 was on the back when he was confronted by the prophet Nathan because of his sin with Bathsheba. Psalm 57 he wrote when he was hiding from Saul. So David is at the top there. But after David, who comes next? Next will be Asaph. Asaph was one of the worship leaders of David's team, and he was the chief musician. He wrote 12 psalms, and then there were some psalms written by the sons of Korah. If you know your Bibles, you know that Korah in the Old Testament led a rebellion against Moses. He was a Levite, and God dealt with him. But many generations later, his sons did not follow the example of their father or their great-grandfather Korah, and actually they wrote songs of worship to God. And so they played a large contribution. They wrote at least 10 psalms in book 2. And then other authors include the likes of Solomon, who wrote many psalms, okay? 2 of them which they found their way into the book of Psalms, Psalm 72 and 127. Moses wrote at least one psalm, Psalm 19. And then quite a lot of psalms also remain anonymous. We don't know who actually wrote them. There are some scholars who think that a Bible teacher by the name of Ezra also wrote a couple of the psalms as well. Well, hopefully that's given you a little bit of an introduction, a bit of flavour into the nature of Hebrew poetry. and the impact that it has upon our thinking and our feeling, as well as a little bit of background in the book of Psalms. Next week, what we'll do is that we're going to delve into examples of different types of Psalms before we look at the greatest song of all later on. Well, here's a question to ponder. And the question is this: do you tend to love God more with your heart or with your mind? Do you tend to love God more with your heart or with your mind? Okay, so that's the question to ponder. Discuss that amongst yourself, in your life group, or with other people that you get to meet up with, hopefully restrictions permitting, in the next week or two. And then the text of study is this. I'd like you to look at Psalm 126. I'd like you to read Psalm 126. And I want you to study it and ask yourself, what type of parallelism is exemplified in Psalm 126? Is it synonymous? Is it antithetic? Or is it synthetic? Okay, there you go. I know it's a bit of a tricky, hard one, bit of homework there for you to do. I know that. But hey, you're a bright bunch, and I'm sure you do particularly well at that. Okay, so read Psalm 126. What type of parallelism is present in Psalm 126? Is it synonymous? Is it antithetic? Or is it synthetic? Well, there you go. Hey, thank you for listening in on our online Bible study, looking at the book of Psalms. Listen, have a great rest of the evening. See you tonight at the prayer meeting. If you can make it at 7:30, that will be awesome. God bless you, and see you soon.